Yo, YouTube, what's the word? How y'all doing? I'm back at it with another video, man. Reacting to another crazy ass video from MrBallen. This probably gonna be the first one I put out, but I really want to start putting these out basically one every week because these gonna be the longer videos. If y'all fucking with that, let me know. If not, like I say, leave another storyteller YouTuber in the comments. Before we get into this video, y'all please like, comment, and subscribe. Y'all keep showing support. Keep spreading the word about my channel and things of that sort. And like I said, I'm back at it with another banger, man. We finna get straight into it. I don't know if I'm gonna break them up into
Early
story
on
by
the
story
afternoon of
or
October 12th,
I'm gonna just let it
1960,
play out.
a 17-year-old high school
I don't
student
know.
named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in
It's
his
probably just
brother's
gonna be
house in the city
dealing
of
with
Tokyo,
editing.
Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and
Skipping
more
school.
often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and
Unpopular opinion. School nowadays do not teach you the criteria that you need to learn.
watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the
Motherfucking
kettle,
water
he took it
hot.
off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite
damn.
figured out what he was going to write,
Nigga said he
but he
gonna write
knew
it down.
whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now,
That's
Otoya had
terrible,
been
though. Why
trying
would you
to
write it down?
articulate
They gonna
this
keep it
bad
for the rest of their
news that was
life.
really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid. What he's talking about can't be serious. And when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And
What
so
was the bad
Otoya
news,
abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen
like tea?
and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt
Y'all
like
tea
he
or
had really
coffee type
grown
of
up
person, hot
and
or
really
cold?
started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved.
Right.
And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so
Not
Otoya had
surprising.
been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo,
shit.
was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, No one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up, he checked the clock, he saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket, he stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on, and then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house, and he put it under his arm, and then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience, and he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start, but all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet.
Oh, shit.
And then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya, at this point, was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. You know, where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash
This dude that's on a podium, right?
Where he pulled out that package he brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it, and he threw the wrapping away, and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd, who would win the Pulitzer, happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life.
Shit. My boy couldn't handle the pressure.
There is exactly one YouTube channel that I personally religiously follow. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's like the most epic storytelling.
Y'all go tune in.
My goodness,
but I did
if you're
not
a
come
fan
for
of
that.
this, and get hooked on them just like I did. But first, check out this clip from the trip.
Story number 2, man.
On a
First one
sunny
wasn't that
afternoon
crazy.
In October
It's not
of
what I'm used to.
2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball
robbed,
court
Richard?
with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was
Shit.
also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable.
Nigga said 16
and
years
so
for
he
a
made
robbery.
friends
Shit.
really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he
Should we call
saw
it
one of the
repeated
guys on the
offender?
blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him, and as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so
Gonna
when
beat his
Steve
ass.
got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say
Man, what the
anything.
fuck?
And he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that, but a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways. What? Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about, and so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad."
The
And
fuck?
Richard was like,
Niggas is
"I
mad
have
about some
no
dumbass shit
idea
like
what you're
that.
talking about.
In prison?
I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where
Buddy
this
did
is coming from."
doing 16
Steve was not
years,
buying
and
it, and
he
he
got
was
a
like,
nigga mad at him
"Richard,
about that."
I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this, and then at some point they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on, and the guards were starting to notice, Steve
just
just
gotta
said, "You
kill
know what,
that
Richard,
shit, no
fine.
doubt."
I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down, is she okay?" And at first Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a
Did he have a
weird
twin?
one-off event. But every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them. Or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing, like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, "You snubbed me in the lunch line." And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning, during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious
Who looked
until
that much like
one
me,
week
bro?
after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line. Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up, and Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night,
16
in the
years
jail
for a
cafeteria,
robbery, though,
when
is
Richard
still
spotted something on the other
bizarre.
side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky
I thought that
Amos,
shit was movie
so it
shit.
just so
What the
happened as
fuck
well
is a
that the
doppelganger in real
doppelganger
life?
shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met. There's no connection whatsoever. They just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird." Well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the
doppelganger
one
is
who committed that
crazy,
robbery
bro. I
in
gotta look the
Walmart.
proof up
And the
behind this
victim and
bitch. Hold
witnesses,
on.
they all confused Ricky for Richard. Here are Richard and Ricky's photographs side by side. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and
Yo. I mean, if you got them side by side, they don't look alike as much as people think. Maybe because he got white hair. Maybe at the time he didn't have white hair. Damn, no, the mustache is crazy. You could easily edit that if you rob somebody. Damn, and why the nigga that looks softer, he look like he more soft. And he the one that's
saw the
actually
two
fucking
photos
doing
side by
dirt.
side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017.
What? Nah. Niggas cannot let that slide, bro. You telling me that he served 16 years of his life because y'all didn't do the right police work? And y'all just let him out free? Like he didn't get no lawsuit, no nothing? That's crazy.
And got a $1 million settlement from the
Oh, he
state.
did?
As
Okay,
for
cool,
the
boom.
doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try.
I mean, they look alike, but like not too much. That
On
blow
the
my
evening of
mind though.
March
Like,
15th,
imagine y'all walking
2018,
through the hold on. Imagine y'all walking through the mall and y'all see a nigga that look identical to you. Like, obviously you gonna know that that's not true or like that's not your twin or nothing like that. But you'll be like, what the fuck? That nigga look hella like me, bro. Like he look enough like dude to where you'll see him in the mall and be like, bro, he do look like me though. Like he look like he could be like a relative to me or something like that. Like if you put them side by side, obviously you could tell the difference. But like that's crazy, bro. He did 16 years and bro, they gave this man 1.1 million for 16 years of his life. That's crazy. All because the state didn't do the right type of motherfucking investigation. And if he had a valid alibi and y'all still charge him, that's crazy.
a 55-year-old man named Jian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians
I ain't gonna lie. This video long as hell. I'm probably just gonna wrap this one up. Y'all not gonna get the third story. If y'all fuck with this video, man, y'all gotta let me know in the comments, though. Like I said, though, I'm back at it with another banger, man. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. I hope everybody is having a good day. Whenever y'all watching this, good morning, good day, good night. If y'all like MrBallen videos, leave it in the comments. And like I said, I'm on y'all last. I'm gonna keep flooding y'all with videos, keep looking for support and hoping y'all show it. Like I said, we that, man. I hope y'all keep tuning in. Y'all like, comment, and subscribe. I'm out.